We leave the chamber for today where the idea of a two-tier NHS dominated the early exchanges, and joining me to discuss that issue and the various others that have come up are Hannah Rodger, who is the chief reporter at the Sunday Mail, and Simon Johnson, who is the Scottish political editor of the Daily Telegraph. And Simon, Douglas Ross asking about this meeting of NHS leaders who floated the idea of asking the wealthy to pay for treatment, essentially to close a black hole in the NHS budget.
Yeah, we found out earlier this week from the BBC that these leaked minutes of this meeting with these NHS directors, and the interesting thing was that things seem to have got so bad now in the NHS that they are having to float ideas such as charging wealthy people, such as restricting new drugs. And basically, Nicola Sturgeon's response is, this isn't going to happen my watch. But the point is that they're having to discuss these sort of things to close what they said was £1 billion hole in their budget. And Douglas Ross was honing in on basically who gave them the authorisation to do this. It said in the minutes that they were given the green light to discuss options that were previously seen as being unpalatable. And he was basically asking, well, who gave them the green light? And I don't think we got an answer on that.
But Hannah, the First Minister absolutely insistent that there were no plans to privatise the NHS, and they would protect the NHS, make it free at the point of need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Simon said about that sort of green light, really, there are still questions over, well, who gave this green light? In what context was that brought up? I think Nicola Sturgeon clearly wanted to distance herself as much as possible from that, but really the issue is, yes, the NHS is in crisis. It's in crisis all over the UK, but in Scotland, I'm sure people watching that won't really be reassured that the problems are in hand in Scotland, because we did see these constant comparisons to the rest of the UK instead of actually just what the situation is here. And ultimately, yes, people are turning to private healthcare providers because they can't get the services that they need, and that's still the issue. And I don't think we really heard very many solutions to that today. And
Anna Sarwar raising the same thing, but he had some figures to go with it, and saying that this two-tier system is already here. Is it 40% of hip and knee replacement surgeries are already private?
Yeah, and that was really quite shocking, and I think the cost of that was something like £12,000 to £13,000 or something. So
it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money for 40% of people who need that treatment to have to find from somewhere. And really, if almost half of people who need that care are having to go private, it does kind of indicate that there is quite a severe problem here.
Simon, Nicola Sturgeon again pointed out, look, there's been a pandemic. The NHS is under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, she's right. There were long waiting lists that obviously built up during that period. But we're coming out of that pandemic now, and what we're seeing is lots and lots of people on waiting lists for things like cataracts, hip operations, etc. You just can't get them. And what they're supposed to do? Are they supposed to live in pain for years and years and years? And unfortunately, some of them I feel they have no other option but to, as Anna Sarwar was saying, borrow money or use all their savings to go private. And that isn't really what the traditional idea we have is, that the NHS is there for you at your time of need, for at the point of delivery. And for a lot of people, that just isn't the case at the moment.
These NHS leaders, in these minutes, we're also talking about the government being divorced from reality, the concern about a lack of clinical input in political decision-making. I mean, the Health Secretary was already under pressure. Does this make it even tougher for him?
Well, it does, because, Douglas Ross is making the point, OK, you're saying you had nothing to do with these discussions, these weren't your ideas and you're not implementing them. So that means that basically the Health Secretary was unaware of health directors discussing these problems, and it was made very clear in the minutes that they just don't see that Humza Yousaf is representing reality to the general public when he's talking about just how bad things are. So basically, he's basically making the point, Douglas Ross, today, that Humza Yousaf has lost control of the crisis, and he's not engaging and discussing with the top people about just how bad it's got.
Hannah, Douglas Ross, the First Minister was saying, I'm not going to take any lessons from the Tories about privatisation, and Douglas Ross had quite a nice quip in response about nobody getting any lessons because of the teacher strike. Were you surprised that those EIS strikes didn't come up today?
I mean, I am gobsmacked, actually, that nobody really mentioned that as an issue. We've got children across the whole of Scotland who are not in school today, as Douglas Ross said, not getting any lessons. You've got, you know, thousands of parents who are being inconvenienced or having to take time off their work so that they can, you know, do childcare, and that's something that's affecting a huge number of people in this country right now. And I was shocked that no one really raised it, apart from as a sort of political quip, as you said.
So there was a revised pay offer on Tuesday, Simon, but that was rejected as insulting.
Yes, I mean, that was the thing. I think as a parent myself, I was given hope over the weekend that something was going to get sorted out and I wouldn't have to put in any alternative childcare arrangements today, but they were sort of dashed on Tuesday. And yeah, the language that was used, it wasn't just, yeah, sorry, that's just not quite good enough. It was, you know, an insult. So it still seems that both sides are miles apart on this. And I know the next strike date, I think, is not until the start of next year, I believe. But
into January, but the SSTA, I think, going out later on next month.
So, I mean, it just seems the two sides are still miles and miles apart. And you know, so...
Shirley-Anne Somerville, Education Secretary, pointing out just unaffordable to provide anyone money.
And presumably there's a link here as well between the teachers and the NHS strikes, in the sense that if the teachers get something, then the NHS workers will want the same thing as well. And the Scottish Government will be very aware that the cumulative cost of all this could be extremely high.
So, Hannah, big issue this week, of course, that Supreme Court decision. We heard Nicola Sturgeon again there talking about democracy denial. I mean, she would still rather the UK government did a deal for a proper referendum.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that is, you know, we saw in the 2014 referendum that the way that kind of came about was described at the time by Alex Salmond as the gold standard. And I think, you know, it really was, in terms of they had permission, if you like, from the UK government. You know, the question was agreed, etc., etc. There was no sort of battle over it. Whereas right now, you know, the UK government are not budging on it. They, you know, despite the number of prime ministers that we've had recently, none of them seem to have got a different opinion on it. And it's really now a question of where Nicola Sturgeon goes from here. She's
talking about this de facto referendum. Do we know how that's going to work, Simon?
Oh, well, we've sort of found out that she thinks if she gets more than 50% of the popular vote, and by that I mean all the nationalist parties, so SNP, Greens, Alaba, then she will have a mandate to open independence talks with the UK government. That's the theory. There's several very basic problems with this, is in that the other parties are not going to be fighting this as a de facto referendum. They're going to be fighting on a range of domestic issues, the cost of living, energy bills, etc., etc. So they won't be engaging with this. And both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer have been pretty clear they're not going to engage with this idea as well. So there's a bit of a sense that she's leading the independence movement down a blind alley here.
Well, so the legal thing has been sorted, but the political issue is still very much alive. Listen, that is all we have time for. My thanks to Simon and to Hannah. We're hoping that World Cup permitting, we'll be back on BBC One next week. But from Holyrood for the moment, bye-bye for now.